You are listening to Beyond the Checkbox, a podcast that focuses on leading strategies around bringing more mental well-being into the workplace. My name is Ryan Todd. I'm a psychiatrist and the CEO of Adversity. I'm sitting down with industry-leading changemakers to break down their process and see how they are going above and beyond for their workforce mental well-being. We're here with Dr. Louis Deslauriers, the Director of Science, Learning, and Teaching at Harvard University. No big deal. You must drop the Harvard bomb all the time. Like when you meet someone, is that the first thing you tell them? Hey, I work at Harvard.
That's the very first thing I tell everyone.
How long have you been at Harvard? You've done you're an engineer by background. You've been really in physics for many years, but teaching is something you've gravitated toward, and then have done some really exceptional studies on things like active learning and these things that we don't always associate with engineers.
Yeah, I started as an engineer. In fact, I wanted to be an aerospace engineer, a pilot, an astronaut. So, but then I started to veer into electrical engineering, and then I went in atmospheric science, and finally I did my PhD in physics and postdoctoral work in physics. But throughout it all, I've always tutored. I really, really enjoyed it. You know, of course, making money on the side, you need that when you're a student, but the teaching aspect, I loved it. So anyway, when it came time to search for faculty positions, I was told that it would be good for me to spend a year or two just learning about, you know, the science of teaching and learning. So that's what I did, and I fell in love with it. So I've been in that field for almost 15 years now.
Now, there's got to be, is there overlap? Like, did your training in engineering and physics, does that translate into pedagogy and like learning and teaching science? I imagine there's some things, but they're very different fields, I think.
Yeah, they're very different fields. So I would break down two types of, science education. One is K-12, and the other one is in higher education. So in higher education, all of a sudden, you actually have to be an expert in the field to even start, doing research in the science of learning and teaching at that level, right? So that's number one. And number two, it's the kind of research that we do in higher education allows us to use our tools and techniques as scientists, as experimental scientists. Let me give you an example. You have to contrast it with what's going on in K-12, where when you do studies in K-12, students' background varies wildly, right?
Sure.
In a math course, you might have a student that will have dabbled in calculus, and in the exact same course, you have some students that are still struggling with basic algebra, right? Whereas in college, there are entrance exams and so forth. So, the background of students is a bit more uniform, right? So there's more level of control on the part of the students, but it's the same thing for instructors. In the K-12 setting, you're going to have an instructor in a school district that somehow, has a PhD in math. Another instructor happens to be the history instructor.
That was my dad. I'm from a small town. My dad taught us gym class, then history, then English. And he probably threw in a little math there. There was like 3 teachers for the whole school, so you have to teach everything. So you're absolutely right about that.
There you go. So when you want to conduct science education studies like experiments, it's completely different. So anyway, that's why in higher education, we call it discipline-based education research. And it's a bit different in the sense that we run it like lab studies, really. We have variables, we put our hands on those knobs, and then we just vary basically, we just turn on and off some of the variables at will, and we do those experiments. So yeah, from that point of view, my training as a physicist really helps.
Are you doing more work in physics or now like in applied learning and teaching and that science? Or are you doing any research and work in physics anymore?
Yeah, I still do some because we have students that take research supervision courses. And sometimes they ask me to do research projects with them. So I really enjoy doing that. That keeps me, involved doing, physics research. So sure, I still do it.
And like Yeah, I sort of think you either have it or you don't in terms of liking to be a teacher. Like like in medicine, it's common where you kind of go, if you're going to be like a doctor, you have your administrative work and your teaching work. And I would say half of the physicians that I know do not like teaching at all. And then half really enjoy it. It sounds like you've gravitated toward it. Like you've gotten a lot of reward from it personally.
Yeah, no, that is the case. But there is an interesting question about is that one of those cases where you have it and you don't? I can tell you the ones that are really effective oftentimes turn out to be those who where it did not come easy at the
Hmm.
beginning. And those people had to actually learn the rules, how it actually works, and then become really, really effective. And on the flip side of that, for those who, teaching came easy, like students like them, they gave smooth lectures. Sometimes those are the ones actually that are not quite as effective in the end. So it's kind of interesting.
What is that? I've heard you speak a little bit about that, something around fluency, and there's a concept there that I'd like you to kind of dive into because I think it's super interesting. It's like the gregarious electric professors, they don't teach as well. Like, is that the basis of it? Like you're more entertained, but you're not actually learning anything?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. When we've all had those superstar lecturers, right? When we were in college, and I still have fond memories of them. But oh, same thing now. Even at my age, we have those seminars, those colloquiums, and you have speakers that come in. Sometimes we have some that are just they must be superstar lecturers. They're smooth as silk. You listen to them and you enjoy the colloquium, and then you see one of your colleague that that can go to the colloquium and you try to explain what you just learned, and you realize, yikes, actually I didn't learn that much, but I really liked it. So yeah, so the idea here is that we there's I would say it's a cognitive bias that we have, a very powerful one at that, where we use perceived fluency as a sign of actual learning.
Mm.
So if a learning experience seems highly fluent to you, that is the ease with which you're processing the information, right, is something you feel, then you will get a strong feeling of learning. So that probably explains why motivational speakers can instill this feeling in the subjects.
But it's a feeling. It's not real hard coding in your brain the information. Like is there something about the struggle? Like if somebody gives you something that's not as fluent and you got to struggle to make it your own and then it becomes fluent through that process. Is that real learning? Is that real encoding? Or am I missing something there?
No, that's right. Like you have to think through, what does it mean to actually learn something, right? When there's new information, that you're exposed to, what does it mean to actually learn it? Uh, well, first, it's there's no way to do this without expending some efforts. That's it.
Mm.
I'll give you some examples of what needs to happen, for your work. If you start to just, explain to me, some complicated things as part of your work, that's new information to me, right? So the first thing I have to do is, as I process information, is to integrate that new information with what's already in my brain. Otherwise, if I don't do this very simple step, that new information might as well be a bunch of phone numbers. And we know how well to remember those.
Like you got to map it onto something that exists.
That's correct.
Like something that already you have a bit of a structure or a paradigm for, you need to map that new thing on in some kind of fangled way onto that old thing.
That's correct. So the
Right.
integration is effortful. It's not something easy. And oftentimes you need, at the very least, you need time to do that. And ideally you have some help to do this. Go through some exercises. You have to make sense of the information. You have to try to see which part of the information actually you can integrate easily, which parts you can't. Questions are going to arise from this. You have to articulate your questions. None of that actually feels fluent, right? So it's just inherently this fluent experience to do that.
Is it is it inversely correlated? Like if it feels clunky and non-fluent when you receive the information, is that way better than if it feels really fluent? Or can you, like the thing I'm trying to understand is if something feels fluent and like I sort of get that the guy or person who is speaking did a great job, they were a superstar lecturer, can that still be learnable content? Or does it have to be kind of like clunky and feel disjointed for you to put it through the strainer and process it and learn it and encode it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Um, so let's see.
Like, I guess what we do know is that if it's fluent and you don't take the time to process it, then it's not going to get integrated. That's a for sure.
It depends how much processing you need to do, right? Like if you explain something to me that has to do with science, I'm likely to have a pretty strong foundation, right? That's going to enable me to process information that's coming from you very efficiently. So that means when you're telling me things, right, about the weather here in Mexico City, which is really interesting. Let's say you were to tell me, Louis, I've been there many times. Let me tell you something about the weather over there. It's pretty high, and so forth. So I'd probably be able to keep up. That is, I'd be able to process information as you're speaking. And the experience, the processing of the information here will not feel quite as disfluent for me. And it's because I have all these prerequisite knowledge already. And that happens to us a lot. And that's why we have this what is the English expression here?
Yeah, no, I was thinking about the fluency of information. If the more fluid is presented, is it going to be integratable? And then you
Now remember, I'm sorry to interrupt. So
yeah.
I like that word a lot, cognitive dissonance. There's a cognitive dissonance whenever, people think about these issues because you've been in situations where things felt smooth and you actually learned something. That's true. You just know that's true. And yet you look at all this research that seems to say something, that seems to say otherwise, that seems to say, hey, no. Learning is inherently disfluent, it doesn't feel good, and so forth. So what gives here? And what gives is basically it's your ability to process information efficiently. So if the information is sufficiently new, then the efficiency with which you will process the information is too low for you to be able to do that in real time when you have a conversation with someone.
Okay, can you say that again? I think that was a really important statement, but I'm processing that right now. But repeat those last couple sentences. I think that was key.
The inherent disfluency that we talked about here, the amount of it, critically depends on your ability to process the information efficiently. And if you have, proper background, if you were to talk to me about physics, even though it would be new to me, I'd probably be able to process the information very efficiently, which gives me enough time and space, right, to do the processing, the adequate processing.
Okay.
And then the experience would feel somewhat fluent, and it would correlate a bit more with what I'm learning.
That makes sense. Like you have a foundation, and I think a lot of it too is language. Like I remember your first kind of couple weeks for me at medical school, you don't even have the language, so everything seems like such a slog to get through things. And I went out for drinks with a buddy the other day, and he brought his brother-in-law who I hadn't met yet, and he was talking to me about commodities trading, but the commodity that he was trading was electricity. And I didn't have the paradigm to map it onto something that previously existed. I think of commodities like oil and gas or gold or something that like you can touch or feel, and that you have to ship it somewhere and then you pay a different amount. But he was talking about like these options and these puts and all these really complicated financial terms. So to your comment, I didn't have that foundation to even understand what he was saying, even when he dumbed it down to such an extreme level, that I didn't have that fluency. And there was But in the end, I probably learned a lot because I spent some time trying to integrate that into something that I already kind of understood. And so I totally take your point that it takes that effort and trying to map it onto something that previously exists.
That's right. That's right. And we don't have to think about classrooms or anything like this. I always tell people, encourage them to simplify things. Like think about a one-on-one conversation with someone. Think about someone giving you directions, to go somewhere. Um, the same rules apply. If someone gives you directions and you have to remember those directions for the next half hour, you imagine someone delivering those instructions really highly fluently with a little joke here, a little joke there. Whereas someone that asks you to repeat, it'll be very awkward. All right, I give you half the directions here. Now I want you to repeat them to me and say them backward. Right? It wouldn't feel quite as good, but guess what? You'd be much more likely to remember them.
That's okay. So the nexus that I'm really interested in is between emotions and learning, because we talk a lot in psychiatry and specifically therapy about teaching skills. And obviously with adversity, that's like what we're all about. We're all about training mental health skills through technology. And something that we say a lot is like if you feel something like or you feel an emotional attachment to something that actually improves the learning. An example of that could be like if you let's say you have depression and you learn a skill like a cognitive behavioral therapy skill, and it makes you feel better. Like the emotion is good after you do a little cognitive behavioral therapy practice. We're typically taught or traditionally taught that reinforces the learning because you have a bit of a reward from that. Is that something that you've also looked into, like the emotional reward behind learning and teaching? Because it sounds like when you're in a lecture and it's very fluent and you feel good, that's not necessarily good learning, which is it kind of is the opposite of some of the concepts that we think about in psychiatry.
Well, I haven't. I mean, I've been interested in this for a long time. Myself, I've had to deal with some mental health issues, like a lot of people, depression, anxiety. So that's something that's always interested me. Um, um, but yeah, so just recently I decided to actually get involved with this, quite a bit. So unfortunately, I have not done any studies or anything like that. But yeah, your question was if I see a relationship, right, in the way students learn and
And how good they feel about it. Like, is there a correlation between how someone, like effectiveness of learning and how good they feel about the learning, like a positive associated emotion? That's kind of the core question. And it sounds like there might not be a correlation. Like sometimes learning doesn't feel good. Sometimes it feels frustrating or slow or too deliberate. And what you're also saying is even sometimes when it feels really good and fluent, you're actually not learning that much.
that's correct. But remember, we also that's for the case where the information is really new, right? So this
Okay.
is clear and it's the same for everyone. What's a bit more difficult is when the information is not quite new and you already have a background, then all of a sudden it's possible that it feels somewhat fluent and that you're actually learning. But of course, the amount of learning is not as much as if you didn't know anything, right? So in a sense, there's no free lunch here. If you want to learn a lot, it is going to feel this fluent. But look, let's talk about how confidence, just common sense here, how you expect confidence to increase when students have evidence of their own mastery, right? That at the end of the day, what we're trying to help students do is to just increase their skill level, increase their mastery, right? So what you have to do, what we know we have to do is show them evidence. In fact, that their mastery has increased, and that presumably increased their self-confidence, and that's protective against feelings of inadequacies, feeling of helplessness. So for sure, this plays a big role, and that's something that really, really interests me. But unfortunately, I wish I had something to, to grab onto, studies that I would have done. I don't. So all I can talk about is, in all my years of teaching, what I've seen, right? And that is a big deal.
And is the correlation that you've seen that the more confident a student becomes, the more easy it is for them to learn? Like the emotion or experience of confidence in and of itself is important for good learning.
Yeah, because, in the hierarchy of sort of meta skills that a students need to be a good learner, to be a good student, right at the top is motivation, right? You need to be motivated. Not motivated, doesn't matter what else a student can do, right? So, and when a student has increases, people refer to that as self-efficacy, right? It's their belief that they can actually achieve something if they just put in the effort. Um, Once they achieve that, you can just see it, that their motivation increases. So, and when
Yeah.
the motivation increases, then of course uh, they're bound to learn more, to feel more successful. So there's a direct link for sure.
Which is interesting because there's it's common sense that you need motivation and you need confidence to learn more. But the thing that I think is interesting is that we're exploring again that nexus, that middle ground between like hard coding something that's factual and an emotional state like confidence. And in some instances like this, we're saying that they're highly correlated. Like that feeling, that good feeling of confidence is likely to be, and we don't have like all the data around it, but it's likely to be highly correlated with good encoding and solid learning in a field.
But students have to be shown evidence of this. I can tell you,
Mm.
when students are in the pit, right, things are messy. They're trying to learn. The only thing they can see is everything that they have yet to master, that they don't know, that they struggle with. You can see it. They're often surprised. You give them a little quiz. In fact, what am I saying? This is this happens all the time, really. You give them a short quiz and they come to you after class and they say, wow, I didn't realize how much I actually understood. And you can see how happy they are. So I'm going to tell you this. This is really interesting, actually. Um, so if a student expends, tremendous amount of cognitive effort, we know that this is inherently disfluent. Yeah, there's not gonna be a positive correlation to, to feeling of self-confidence, feeling that they've learned a lot. That's the paper we were referring to, right? Where there's a anti-correlation between actual learning versus feeling of learning, right? So at the beginning, again, let me repeat here, that did not come out well. At the very beginning, when a student is struggling with learning something new, they're not going to feel very confident. They're not going to feel that they're learning a lot. Over time, they will, but they need to see evidence that they've actually learned something. And this is not as it's not as automatic as you would think.
Mhm.
So for that, it often requires a midterm exam for them to come in and sit through the midterm. Then they'll tell you right after the exam, I can't believe, how much I actually understood. I did not realize that I knew this much. So if I had to draw a curve, I would say that the confidence that students feel initially is high, then it comes down to minimum, and then it goes higher. Um, in fact, there's a name for this. It's the Kruger-Dunning effect.
And that effect is you have confidence initially. Hey, I can do this. The more you get into it, you're like, the more you don't know, your confidence lowers. And then you can rebuild that confidence over time with little reinforcements.
That's right, with actual evidence of your skill level.
Okay. That is that is interesting. And I always wonder about the applicability of this in classroom learning to things like mental health skills. Because and you'd be expert in speaking to this. Like, do you think that the teaching around things like science, where you're learning new skills, and you have the confidence, hey, I can do this. And then the more you learn that you don't know, you lose your confidence and you gain it back over time. Do you think that, or do you feel rather that correlates to skills like cognitive behavioral therapy skills or clear thinking skills or mindfulness skills or energy management skills, like these core mental health skills? Do you think that those same principles apply and hold true?
Course. And I have done cognitive behavioral therapy. And yeah, I can tell you it's exactly the same thing. At the very beginning, you think, you know what? I think I got this. You know, you do this little exercise here, analyzing a micro portion of your day, right? You're like, okay, I nailed that. And then the better you get at it, then the more you realize, holy moly, there's a lot of work to be done here. It's exactly the same thing.
And I bet the challenge is to not lose people in that trough, like students, but also learners in therapy, or people who are practicing on adversity, trying to learn a new skill in terms of taking care of their mental health. Is that a challenge that you see with students? Is that they might not have the motivation to come out the other side of the curve?
Oh, all the time. In fact, that's probably one of the most important part of my job, I feel like. To talk to them and to first to remind them of the goal, how good it's going to feel when they're done with that course, all the knowledge that they're going to have, right? To remind them of the goal, and then to remind them of the progress they're already making toward that goal. And as a learner, and same thing in cognitive behavioral therapy, when you're in the pit, right? Struggling, trying to get better, it's very hard to have the self-awareness, to be able to see the progress that you're actually making, right? And students certainly don't have that self-awareness. So that's the role that as a therapist or as a teacher that you have to play. Find ways. Students are not stupid. You can't just tell them you're doing great, right? Same as patients. So you have to find ways to show them that they're progressing. And I always tell people, give students, some very short quizzes, on things that they've made progress on, and then show them, how much better they're doing on these kinds of quizzes every week. And students respond very positively to that.
And in your experience, that's enough to get them to the other side of the curve.
Well, students are all different. Something else, maybe this is touchy, I should be careful talking about this, but there are all sorts of people. We're all different. And there's some people that have a little bit of, for lack of a better word, a little bit of narcissism. And I always joke to my wife that I envy these people because, God, it helps them get them through the curve,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because I speak to that person. It's not many students. I don't want to say like half my students are like that, but I speak to these students and I can kind of see, okay, I think that's one of those cases. And I'm like, you're not doing well. In my mind, I'm thinking you're not doing well. I'm not even sure if you're going to make it. But the student just like, yeah, this is good. I want to do this. I want to do that. And I'm like, okay, go for it. And by golly, these people just keep on going.
I wish I had that too. I might have a little bit of that. Um, and in medicine, they experienced preceptors will talk about a knowledge, skill, confidence gap. So over here, you have your knowledge and your skills about a certain presentation. Let's say I don't know, you need to be able to read an EKG or a little heart scan. And their confidence in their ability to do that is very high, but their knowledge and their skill is very low. The preceptors will say that's the most dangerous situation. You'd rather have an individual who has low confidence and low skill, or they have low confidence and high skill. Those are all more safe than having really high confidence and low skill, because you'll make judgment calls and you'll say, yeah, I think it's a elevated ST segment or whatever it is. Or you might call something that isn't there, false positive, false negative. And that can be really dangerous. So it's really applicable to the medical teaching model. Is this like narcissism? And I would say that I'd like to do a study on narcissism in physicians. I would imagine it's a little more than the average profession, in my experience. I don't have data to back that up, though.
Certainly adaptive, right?
That it is like undoubtedly adaptive because you are asked to do things when you're like I started medical school when I was like 21 and I was a staff doctor when I was just under 30 years old. And so you're asked to do things that are not normal human things, like, tell a mother that her daughter has a brain tumor. Like that's not a normal human experience. And you're like, okay, you're 24 years old, go and have that conversation. So you're asked to do really non-human things at a very young age. So that narcissism, that actually like you need a little bit of that to do some of these like really bizarre tasks that are part of the job, I think. And maybe get through some of the learning that and I wonder if like your PhDs in physics and like really high levels of learning also need some of that too, to to have the confidence or even the narcissism that they're gonna master a topic that like 0.001% of the world has the ability to master.
Absolutely. Oh no, no, it's yeah, it's super adaptive. I see it in colleagues that are extremely successful. And it doesn't have to be the amount of narcissism that makes it so that they're undesirable people or anything like that. You just see that there's a little bit of it. Um, so no, you can certainly see it. Absolutely. I'd love to do that study too, but I'd probably lose my job.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about active learning because you speak about that and you've done some work in that, and I wanted to clarify a couple of concepts around it. First, just take us through like how you define or think about active learning versus maybe passive learning, because I think that's highly applicable to our learners on Headversity and the folks watching this podcast who we're all learners. So how do you define it and how do you think about active learning?
Yeah, no, it's a term that's definitely overused now, and I think it's misunderstood. So because look, when you're listening to an instructor that's giving a traditional lecture, people would say that's not active learning, but then I'd say, wait a minute. I mean, students, if they're paying attention to what the instructor is saying, they're actively engaged, right? So in that sense, there's active engagement. If you're reading a book, we know that this is not the best form of learning, right? But you're actively engaged if you're paying attention to the book. So active engagement, sorry, is sort of the bare minimum. And when we say active learning, what we mean is to go beyond that. It's to provide students the best means possible to make the active engagement productive, toward the goal, the learning goals.
So there's a stepwise difference between active engagement and active learning. Like active learning is actually processing things actively to get to an end goal. Engagement is like, are you paying attention or not?
That's right. That's right. So even though, you listen to people describing these things, they'll say, a classroom that's where students are actively engaged. But like I said, that's just bare minimum. And if we keep our analogy to giving someone directions, right? Being actively engaged would be for me to listen to you giving me directions. But the next question is, all right, how do you make that interaction, really productive, toward the goal of remembering as much of the information as possible and to be able to use it a half hour later. And for this, it would require then some interventions on your part to make my thinking as productive as possible during the learning event. So that's what we mean. That's what we ought to mean when we talk about active learning.
Can you teach instructors? And then the second question is, can you teach a model or technology on how to do that? Like, is that an either you have it or you don't? Like you either teach active learning or you don't. Is that something that you can teach instructors to do? Is create active learning environments?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Um, yeah, absolutely. Look, you know, as part of my job, I talk to colleagues all the time, about active learning and how they can implement that in their courses. And I've done this for now 15 years. I always tell instructors this. I'm like, all right, you want to start doing some active learnings? How about this? Every 5 minutes, just stop talking and tell students think about the information that I just told you for the last 5 minutes, right? So that gives time, and space for students to process the information. So that's a little bit of active learning, right? It's certainly more productive than having them just listen the whole time. And then I would say this is significantly more productive than having them listen the whole time. So it is genuinely active learning. But the question is to let students to their own devices to just think, is that the most productive way that you could do active learning? And the answer is no. So then that's where the research comes in. People that do research, they try to find the best ways to sort of, help students be as productive as possible as they're thinking about the material.
And I imagine there's a tension there because you have an institution, a medical school, a department of science, and they're like, if you want to graduate from this class, you need to learn these 20 topics and these like 80 subtopics, and it has to all be covered. Like that's part of the thing. Did you cover this? And I don't know if the output is always, did you learn this? It's always like, did you cover this? And can you answer some exam questions on that? But it's interesting to think that you could just let students just kind of think about something for 5 minutes. And that's probably a more effective use of their time in that moment than just speaking at them for an additional 5 minutes.
Of course, there's no doubt. Again, if the information is new, right? If the processing required, as we discussed previously, right, is difficult enough, right? Then yeah, you have to stop talking and you have to let students think. But again, if I'm in a colloquium and students are talking, the colloquium speaker is talking about something I already have some background in, I probably don't want that speaker to just give me a few minutes to think about what he or she said in the last 5 minutes. I probably don't need that.
Then you can just process it in real time. Like it's actively, okay. That ties back to your previous point that I now understand. If you have that foundational knowledge, you can be processing things very quickly and hearing more and more information about it in real time.
The word I was looking for earlier was cognitive dissonance, that we all have these learning experiences where we kind of know, wait, it kind of felt good and I felt like I learned something. Yeah, that's because you had the proper background. So the processing was much more efficient.
So what do you think about, we're on a podcast in 2024, so we have to talk about AI or they'll essentially shut our podcast down. What do you think about, can you train models to actively teach? Is there something there in terms of artificial intelligence that can help improve learning outcomes in your experience?
Yeah, in fact, it's funny. I didn't know you were going to talk about this. I co-founded a startup that use AI to do just that, actually.
Well, that's awesome. Tell me all about it.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of tries, a lot, actually, this fever, this excitement about bringing AI in education. And take AI model like GPT, for example. You just have students, you basically build a GPT wrapper, and then you have a student basically that's being asked questions by GPT. You know Khan Academy, by the way?
No, off the top of my head, I don't.
Yeah. So, yeah. So essentially, you have AI ask students question like, well, you have this equation here. What's the first step? And the student answers something. And then what's nice is that the AI is able to to sort of adapt to what the student is, where the student is at, right? The student says, yeah. So that's the beauty, and that's wonderful. But there's something fundamental that's missing, and what's missing is that the AI never had in its training data knowledge of student thinking. And until you really think about this, you don't realize how absolutely critical the knowledge of student thinking is. In fact, it's got to be the same thing as a therapist. Your ability to interact with your patients, relies in large part in your ability to simulate what's going on in their own minds, right? And there is no way you can learn that from a textbook. you have to have had a lot of experience with different human beings to be able to simulate that clearly so that you can truly personalize your responses to a patient. It's no different when you teach. So, and I'm happy to give you some very tangible examples of that. So that information, what's really interesting is in the teaching domain, you acquire this after teaching a course, say 3-4 times, right? You've talked to a lot of students and you realize the type of things that they really struggle with, right? The common difficulties. And then you learn the most effective ways to help them when they have these difficulties. Essentially, you develop a sophisticated understanding of how they think, right? What's interesting is nobody ever bothers to write this down, right? You go somewhere and that person has taught for 10 years the same course. That person has this unbelievably expensive and valuable information, never written down, and that person retires. And then that, that knowledge gets erased. So it's that knowledge that experienced teachers and experienced tutors have that makes them so valuable. And yet that knowledge is nowhere for AI to be trained on. So the startup that I started, the main value that we provide really is to take experienced teachers and tutors, and we actually use AI to extract information from their brain, to extract that information. And I thought about therapy a lot, and that could be done in the medical setting as well. You extract that information efficiently, and then you actually use that as training data for the AI model. And then all of a sudden, now when you use the AI model, it feels a lot more human-like.
Yeah, that's brilliant, because that is the missing link when it comes to teaching as a therapist, and learning as a client or patient, however you want to state it, because that empathy or that theory of mind, like, after some experience and typically hours of talking to someone, or individuals who have similar kind of childhood experiences, how they might think about something. And then you propose that, and then they say yes or no or titrate it somewhere in between, and then you learn something. You land on a type of response that's titrated very accurately to that individual. And that is what what I think these ICBT models that have sprung up have made them so rudimentary, is that they don't have that feedback loop that can quickly titrate how that individual might be thinking about something. And I think there's a lot of theoreticians who might say that that is theory of mind, or that is empathy. And that is what AI is lacking. And I've seen there's some startups who are trying to build like emotional learning into AI models, and I just haven't seen it where it actually makes sense yet. So I think that's a really interesting thesis for your startup, and I think it'll do well.
Yeah.
I want to wrap up because I think we have a lot to talk about, but there's so much here that I want to kind of consolidate some of the major pieces here from my own learning. So the number one thing I took from our session today was that we don't always learn as much as we think we learn, especially if we're in front of one of those superstar type of lecturers with net new information. That's really important to know. Sometimes we have to struggle with that information, make it our own, integrate it onto a current learning map for new information. But when we have that foundation, we can then benefit from someone who also has fluency in that teaching style, because we can integrate that information quickly. So that's a key takeaway for me. Another big takeaway for me today was that type of model in terms of learning and the things that we can understand from the classroom. For example, that learning curve, you have tons of motivation and you can go for it and you have confidence, and then you fall into the trough because you find out what you don't know, and you can build that back up with small reinforcements. That can also be highly applicable to mental health learning. And I think that's really interesting. And then finally, the piece about active learning, I think is very interesting, because I think that can also be applied to our learners in our Headversity universe, and what active learning really is. And then the next question is, can we utilize AI models to integrate active learning into that? So thank you for joining me today. It was a super interesting discussion. I learned a lot. I'm going to have to think about a lot of this new information to integrate it onto a map that I have.
How much
And
of it is feeling? Yeah,
yeah, but I feel good about it. So did I learn something or not? I don't know.
there you go.
Awesome. Well, enjoy the rest of your trip. Thank you for taking some time out of it in Mexico City to join us today on Beyond the Checkbox.
Sounds great. Very nice to meet you. It was a pleasure.
All right. Take care now.